two-sorted first-order language, so there will be a separate sort here for direction terms. That's no big deal. You could get around that if you wanted to. The base sort is precisely like the original language, so that's a sort of variables, terms, predicates they use to refer to the good old familiar concrete objects. And then they have a new direction sort that consists of terms and predicates that are reserved for directions. Okay? And then a special identity predicate that can be flanked by suitable terms from that new sort. And then, of course, they have the all-important direction of operator, so they can talk about the direction of a certain line. Right? So that's the language just characterized syntactically that they now adopt. Then we will say something about how that language is used. Okay? And it'll be used precisely as if they're talking about directions. But you can cast that out, what it is to use that language precisely as if they were talking about directions, in a way that doesn't itself make any appeal to directions. Right? And this is where there's something like the elimination requirement present. So let me just give you some examples of that, which will convey the flavor of it quite nicely. So there's a criterion of identity, of course, that two lines will count as presentations of the same direction, if and only if they're parallel. If you want to not identify the direction of that line with the direction of that line, you can do that by looking at a slightly more fine-grained equivalence relation. But no matter, that's not important. What matters is that there will now be conditions of correct use describing how the extended language is to be used. And that we could describe now the conditions of correct use, not saying a word about directions, the controversial kind of objects. Right? So what do we say? Well, an identity statement of the form, this direction is identical with that direction, that will be assertable if and only if the two lines that one picked out, L1 and L2, say, if and only if they're parallel. Right, so I've specified the suitability conditions for identity statements. What about other predications made of directions, like being north pointing? Well, you can now have a predicate north applying to directions, and you could then say that it's correct to say of a certain direction that it points north, if and only if the line that's used to pick out that direction, L, is a north pointing line. And you could see that this all works logically, so there's stuff about congruence here that needs to be appealed to. But the basic idea is the one at the bottom of the slide. So this extended language that works precisely as if you're talking about directions, right? And absolutely indiscernible from a language in which the Platonist is talking about directions. Correct use of that language can be specified not saying a word about directions. And that's nice, since that means that no one could really quibble with the community's entitlement to adopt that language. They just want to speak that way. They've laid down conditions governing the use that are acceptable to the nominalist. No problem about any of that. But then the years go by, and members of the community become more sophisticated, and they start reflecting on what they've done when they expanded their language in that way. And one of the questions they ask in their more reflective state is, what's the correct semantic interpretation of our extended language? Right? It's used in a particular way, but how are we to interpret it semantically? And then this is where the internalism comes in. So then the claim is that it's perfectly permissible for the speakers of the extended language to use the resources that they have available in their extended language to theorize about how this language is to be interpreted semantically. Right? And among the resources they've got are direction terms. Right? So from their extended point of view, they can now use their direction terms to say that, hey, what we do with our direction terms is actually to refer to directions. One can argue, and I've done so in another paper, that this is actually the preferable semantic interpretation of the extended language. So not only is it permissible for the speakers of the extended language to use their resources to theorize about how the language is to be interpreted semantically, but the best way to interpret that language semantically is the Platonistic way. So how does this differ from deflationism, for instance, which I rejected as one of the answers to the big question? Well, deflationism didn't want to say anything substantive about what the relational reference amounts to. Here we're saying quite substantive things, right? So we're saying something about what facts about reference consist in. So how come D of A refers to a particular direction? Well, first you need to pick up the referent of the line term in question. Then you need to look at the direction of that. Right? So there's a story about reference of substantial terms, criteria of identity are being appealed to here. So you're going way beyond what the deflationist would admit or be happy with. And then on that basis you conclude making use of the internalist move that I've been talking about, that the direction term in question does indeed refer to direction. So, how am I doing for time?
Great, you've got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, all right.
Well, 5, you can stretch it to 10 or so.
Well, yeah, I want to have a long, nice discussion here, so I'll see if I can wrap up quite soon. One more substantive thing that I'll say then, and then I'll go to the conclusion. And this is back to the question of realism. Right? So I started by talking about Frege's realism, and now we have an account of reference to mathematical objects in which the objects being referred to don't figure. Right? So the elimination requirement is still in place. This kind of missing spouse reaction is still a reaction one ought to have here. So does that mean that the realism here is somehow less robust? And this is a good occasion then to say a bit about what Frege has to say concerning contextual definitions and realism. And Frege then says things here that are quite compatible with the kind of account that I'm somewhat tentatively describing to him. Right? So he says, for instance, the following: if there are logical objects at all, and the objects of arithmetic or such, then there must be a means to grasp them, to recognize them. Right? We must have a way of answering our epistemological question. The basic logical law which permits the transformation of the generality of an equality into an equality serves for this purpose. So this is the going from one line of Frege's basic law 5 to another, one side of Frege's basic law 5 to another. This is going from one side of an abstraction principle more generally to the other side. That kind of transformation from one side to the other serves exactly for this purpose. Without such a means, the scientific justification of arithmetic would be impossible. For us, it serves the purposes which for other mathematicians are supposed to be achieved by the creation of new numbers. Right? And here he's referring to his polemic against all these people who say that we just create new mathematical objects, and that's how we solve the epistemological problem. Another passage where it really looks like Frege is he's saying something tremendously surprising here, I think. To those of us used to reading him as a super robust realist. So can our procedure of going from one side of the abstraction principle to another, or going from a sentence in which the term whose reference you're studying occurs to a sentence in which that term has been eliminated, can that procedure be called a creation? Are we too now creating mathematical objects in the way that Frege criticized others for doing? The discussion of this question can easily degenerate into a quarrel about words. What? It's just a semantic issue now that whether Frege too is engaged in creation. He's been remarkably concessive here. In any case, our creation, if one wishes so to call it, is not unconstrained and arbitrary, but rather the way of proceeding and its permissibility is settled once and for all. And with this, all difficulties and concerns that otherwise put into question the logical possibility of creation fall by the wayside. And by means of our value ranges, Frege's extensions, we hope to achieve everything that these other paths fall short of. So it really looks like Frege is saying that the key advantage of what he's doing, advantage over his creationist opponents, is systematicity, rigor, and so on. And this is perfectly systematic and rigorous, what I have been proposing. So I don't actually think this is incompatible with the amount of realism that Frege wants. Let me then skip over that material as predicted and sum up. So I made this key claim then that when interpreting the context principle, it's really important to see clearly that all of Frege's work needs to be taken into account, not just the early work, so including the work he says. Appearances notwithstanding. And here are some of the appearances that shouldn't be withstood. And then once we have all that text on board for interpreting the context principle and trying to put it to use, the important lessons follow. Right? So two of the standard lines that you find in the literature about how the big question, the missing spouse question, is to be answered, namely recarving and deflationism about reference, they both have to be rejected. And for several reasons perhaps, but one very clear-cut reason in either case is incompatibility with the context. And then I said something about an alternative way of trying to make sense of ideas, roughly like Frege's context principle. That is my own favorite way of spelling that. So I'll end at that point in order to have a good time for discussion.
Thanks a lot. This very lovely talk. Being a fan of Frege's philosophy of math myself, I really enjoyed it. So I would like to spare some room for questions from PhDs and students before I leave it to the faculty members.
That's a good idea.
So, is there any question from our students? Maria.
Sorry, can we come back to the explanation of internalist, of the internalist interpretation of the extended language?
Yeah, let's see.
Yes.
So about here, is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I didn't understand how we pass from saying that the extended language works as if we refer to directions. To the existence.
To saying that we actually do. Yeah.
To realism.
Yeah, and that's a key move. So that's a good place to slow down and look a bit at what's going on. So the idea is really the following: that you're starting with your nominalistic base language, right? That's used in a particular way which makes a certain interpretation of it right. we're just taking that for granted. So maybe a particular singular term here, T, refers to this chair, some other term refers to you, who knows. And then I described the extended language. And I did that then by talking primarily, or at least initially, about how it's to be used. Right? So we lay down systematic conditions governing the legitimate or correct use of the language, which have two features really. So one feature was that for every sentence of this language, let's just look at sentences so we don't have to worry about free variables. That will be assertable or count as correctly used if and only if some condition is met, and that condition says nothing about directions. Okay? So the condition here is that it's acceptable to the non-linguist. Right? The other feature of the use conditions governing the language is that the inferential behavior of the language will be precisely as if you're, and this is the as if that you picked up on, as if you're referring to and quantifying over directions. Right? So there are terms like D or L that look syntactically like they're in the business of referring to directions, but not only do they look so syntactically, they also behave in that way. I hesitate to say semantically, but with regard to the conditions of correct use. It isn't yet full-fledged semantics. Right? So it's used precisely as if. And then we were at the background to your question. How do you go from using the language as if you're referring to directions to actually being such things? And this is where the internalism comes in. So step one is to argue that it's legitimate for the community to adopt that language. Right? Use conditions that are clear, sharp, nominalistically acceptable, all fine and good. And then next step is to say that when they reflect on their language, they're allowed to draw on the resources of that very language. Right? So they are really using this language to study their own language, right? And ask, how is that to be interpreted semantically? We know how it's actually used. That's been given, and that can be described by psychologists or whatever. But what's the right semantic interpretation of it? And then it's permissible for them to use all the expressive resources of that language, including that direction terms, to say something about, well, that kind of term. Does it refer to some sort of object or right? And then they can say, well, yes it does. So if this one refers to a particular line, let's say A, then that object they're referring to is that direction of A, using then their ability to engage in direction. So that's the idea of using internalism to make that second step that you're asking about. Does that help you get a sense for it? Yeah.
Any further questions from the students? Okay, so I think we shall give the floor to the faculty members. Are there any questions from the big guys?
Everyone.
Okay. Elisabetta?
Before giving the words to me.
No.
This is just a question to widen the range of the investigation, not just on the epistemological side, but also on the question of objectivity.
Okay.
It is, I've always thought that when Frege introduced the context principle, his interest was not only in finding an answer to the Kantian question, how can individuals in such a way as to
react to sort of empiricist epistemology, with which only through senses we can, what is objective can be given to us. So I really thought that his problem was twofold. On the one side, there was a problem of giving an answer to the epistemological question, how can I have access to numbers and in general to abstract objects? Is anything that is not cannot be an object for the senses. And the second question, also connected with the first one, was how can we account for the status of this object being objective, not as subjective representation. Of course, he could have said, yeah, they just have subjective status as representation. So this is the complexity, the real complexity of the issue that they try to consider. And maybe I have just missed some parts, but I haven't really heard in your presentation mention of the sense. The sense. It is true that in Grundlagen the distinction was not really introduced. But in a sense, it's talk about the criteria of identity seems to go in the direction mature distinction, and I think it is difficult to answer the question about the objectivity if one does not introduce into the picture the notion of sense. But it is a very big question.
No, that's good.
It's just good. Maybe to introduce this other side of the discussion.
I'll say something about it.
And what do you think about this issue?
Good. So you're definitely right that there were several things going on in the context principle. So you picked out two of them. So there is a Kantian question of reference to abstract objects, or how they're given to us, or epistemically accessible. But then there's also stuff, as you pointed out, about objectivity as opposed to the reference, as opposed to subjectivity, of there being somehow mental object, individual to each person who's engaging in arithmetical talk, say, or direction talk. And I focus very much on the first of these questions, absolutely right, and didn't say much about the second question at all. But the second question is certainly there in the Grundlagen, no doubt about it. And one way you see that is from the introduction to the book, where Frege sets out the three core principles that will guide him throughout the work. Right, and one of them is the context principle, and then another is the object-concept distinction, and the third is the one you're after, the objective-subjective distinction. So never confuse what's objective with what's merely an idea in someone's mind, and therefore subjective. So I think the connection here is that if you are puzzled by the opening question, that a reference to abstract objects, and you fail to see that the context principle may help us here, you may out of despair consider going very subjective on this question. In the following sense. So it looks to you, so consider an arithmetical thought. It looks to you like you're referring to some sort of object, you have your singular term, say you're saying 7 is prime. So what does the term 7 here stand for? And if there's no way available to you of accounting for how it stands for some objective object, which would have to be abstract, then you may just say that, look, maybe it refers to an idea, and that's a way. So failing to answer question 1 may lead you to go subjectivistic on question 2. And I think that's why the two questions come up side by side early on. But since I'm really attacking question number 1 head on and trying to give a positive answer to it, so there is a way of accounting for this, I would then avoid this pressure towards subjectivity or some sort of subjectivism concerning mathematical objects. So I said less about it. You also said something about sense, Phrygian sense, in your question, and how that relates to what I was talking about. I try to say as little as possible about that, since there's already a lot going on in this talk. I didn't want to confuse people more than necessary. But really, my terminological choices here are as follows: that I use meaning as the generic term, meaning or content. Right? So that means any kind of notion of semantic content. And then I look at the later Frege and the sense reference distinction, and use those two terms in Frege's technical works. So a lot of what I'm doing is really just to look at any notion of meaning and whether it might serve to be plugged into an account of the context principle and somehow do the job. So I'm quite open about what meaning might be, but of course my own preferred answer is that one should make do with the two Frege notions of sense and reference. And then yes, I talked about criteria of identity, and that does sit nicely with sense and an account of sense, absolutely. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that okay.
Sure, Andrea has questions.
Okay, so Andreas next.
Yeah, I have a few questions, but just to keep almost on the same area of Elizabeth's questions, I would like to ask you about this very slight, well, not very slight, but the issue of the less robust form of realism that seems to come out of the picture, because there's in the debate also Michael Dammit raised a similar view, saying that the sort of reference that we can bestow to singular terms through abstraction principle is not the sort of robust reference that either Frege or Crispin or Linnebo would like to have, but it's a moderate, that the term was, whatever, moderate probably.
Moderate reductionism is one term that he uses, tolerant reductionism.
His idea was just that the sort of, what you recover is a notion of semantic value and not of robust reference. So, but there's no hint in this view as something close at all to the idea of creation. So my question was, I was a bit surprised of listening that in some sense you suggest a less robust form of realism as a way of accounting for those strange claims by Frege that we can also talk of creation when we go from the non-problematic to the problematic statement. So I was wondering how close you come to the idea that abstraction principle could be intended as creative definitions.
Yeah, it's primarily a defensive move I'm engaged in when I talk about less robust form of realism. So I'm struggling with what I've been calling the missing spouse question. So you're trying to account for the reference of terms of that sort, and you're trying to do so, not actually saying anything about directions. It's very bizarre. And then my particular attempt to do that is to describe then the extended language, use conditions for it, where the controversial kind of objects are not being built in. And then you have the question come up again. So if that is what's underlying the use of the language, then how could that possibly give you genuine reference to directions? It looks like you haven't built in enough to get that out. And then I'm making the defensive move of saying that, look, if you want to call this a somewhat less robust realism on this grounds that the account of the underlying reference fact doesn't mention directions, then be my guest. And Frege is doing something similar when he considers these challenges in a remarkably conciliatory manner. Right? So can our procedure be called a creation? You would have expected Frege to say, in no sense whatsoever. They were wrong, I'm right. And, but then he sounds remarkably consensus. Right? So there are features that are a little bit like that, and here I take him to have in mind what I've been labeling as the missing spouse issue, that the reference don't play a substantive role in the account. So is that a basis for saying that there's something a little bit like creation? Well, of course he wouldn't want to say that it is creation, but what really matters is that this be set out in a way that's rigorous and technically clear. So that's really all I want. Let me say a bit about realism then, which is a tricky issue. So directions, what kind of metaphysical status do they have? Do we create them in the sense that before people started talking about directions, I don't know, in ancient Mesopotamia or whatever, 5,000 years ago, let's say, was the first direction talk, so directions didn't exist until 5,000 years ago. I mean, that would be madness, right? That would be a horrible conclusion, since you can, of course, talk about the direction of a stick back in the Stone Age, right? We can. And say that directions existed then, and indeed they exist atemporally. So something very important here will be to have the objects that you're explaining, the directions in this case, be counterfactually independent laws. Right? So it's not as if had we not started talking about directions, then the directions wouldn't have existed. That would be bad. Right? But that's something you can have, and I didn't mean, when I'm considering the possibility of easing up on the realism, it's not anything nearly as dramatic as denying the counterfactual independence of directions or not.
So it's not clear in which sense it would be it's sort of creation.
Yeah, it's not clear. It's
not the focus, it's mainly phrase.
Yeah, so it's mostly just saying that Frege was aware of this kind of issue, that it is odd to give that kind of explanation, and that when your account of what the reference fact, or the fact that a particular term refers to a direction, that the account of that fact says nothing about directions, then if that seems like a slight backing off of realism, then Frege might actually be fine with that. That's my point. There's more to be said about the relation between what I said and done it, which you brought up. Well, maybe we should see if no other questions have been back to it.
Yes, so are there any further questions? We still have a little time, so you can go on with this, but I would like to save a little room for myself.
I have also different questions if you want to jump in now.
Okay, I'll just put a question and then I'll leave it to you. Okay. So at the beginning of the talk, you mentioned that the idea of using so thoroughly Frege's context principle would lead you to predicativity or abstraction principles. And you didn't, I'm not really sure you mentioned this, but as I got it from the paper that you circulated before the talk, it's hard that you can get to use Frege's context principle to justify impredicated uses of abstraction principles. So I quite like the idea of having so solidly Fregean motivations for predicativity, but because most of the literature that has been put some restrictions on abstraction principle is using restrictions which are not Fregeanly compatible with the Fregean view of mathematics. But now obviously the question would be, okay, so Frege's original picture was, I'm going to give you this fantastic, beautiful theory grounded in merely logical basis for recovering at least full second-order piano arithmetic. So what I get from your talk is that if you're really serious about context principle, then you have to go predicated, whether first or second order, as far as abstraction principles are concerned. But usually, predicated restrictions on abstraction principles come with a certain price. So you don't get much mathematics out of it. So usually, Robinson arithmetic, if you're lucky, and it's really, I mean, it's a very good and not trivial at all, fragment of mathematics, but at the same time, it's quite too few, especially as compared to Frege's original picture of, found in arithmetic on merely logical basis. So I was wondering, what are you going to do?
I'm glad you're saying that, since there are really two things going on here, or maybe even more, but I'm using the elimination requirement to really derive the restriction to predicate abstraction principles. So principles that are like the direction principle. So I'm saying that if you want to characterize the correct use of your extended language in a way that's cashable out by the likes of the original language, then the abstraction principle that you're using to expand can only be predicated. Right? Now that has one big advantage and one big disadvantage. So let me begin with the good news. And the good news is that any kind of abstraction principle is now safe or permissible. Right? So those of you who know this literature will know that there is the so-called bad company problem. So many of the abstraction principles that we've been talking about, principles of this form, are inconsistent. Right? So Frege's principle 5 is one example of a principle of this form, and that's horribly inconsistent. So when you look at principles that are predicated, there's no bad company problem to worry about. So the counterpart of basic law 5 would be that you start with a domain of objects, so say the people in this room, and then you do extension or class abstraction on that domain. And then you get classes whose members are from the original domain. And that's what you get. It's not a whole lot, but it's one level, so to speak, of classes on top of the base domain. So it's a bit, but it's a case that of Frege's basic law 5 not misfiring. So the predicative analog of it is perfectly fine and gives you then classes from the original domain. Okay, so that's a good news. No bad company problem to worry about. The bad news is the concern that you raised, Francesca, of strength, of this not actually giving you a lot. So if you start with a finite domain, for instance, as in the toy example of a domain composed of all people in this room would give you, then of course you're going to get a very weak mathematical theory out, namely the theory of classes of people in this room. So only finitely many objects still, so you couldn't even interpret Robinson arithmetic or any kind of semantics, since it's a finite domain. So you have your original domain, and then there's an extended domain now of all the classes of objects from the original domain. So there's a weakness problem. But the good thing is that when you do language expansions of the sort I've been talking about, you can iterate. Right? And you see that very clearly in the case of basic law 5 when I'm talking about classes. Right? So if we first start with the original domain of people in this room, and then you adopt an extended language L1, which is exactly as if you're now talking not only about people in this room, but also about classes of people in this room. Right? So that is like you have a larger domain, and then I'm going to make the same internalist move as came up that from the point of view of the extended language, you can make sense of what you have done, with a reference to the new object. So then you've got somewhat more, and then you can say, hey, I've got a bigger domain. I can do another abstraction by means of the predicated analog of Frege's basic law 5. I've got a lot of objects now. I can introduce class talk relative to that domain. So then you're going to get a larger domain, right, with even more classes of classes from the original domain. And mixed levels for that matter. Right, so then you've got more, and then we can just keep going in that way. And that whole process of stepwise extending the interpretation of the language in that way can itself be studied. I've been doing that in some other work, and that will actually be closely related to a talk I'm going to give in Part.2 tomorrow. So a little bit of advertising for that. And then when you look at the whole system of language expansions of that sort, then you get the real strength. Right? So the individual steps are tiny and don't take you all that far. But there's a way of theorizing about the whole system of such expanded language or language extensions. And that's where the real strength comes in.
So you basically need infinitely many extensions of your language in order to recover enough first-order individuals to make, to recover natural number.
Unless you're lucky and have a copy of the natural numbers already here. So, but if you don't, then you will need a countable infinity of language extensions.
Right. But in order to have infinitely many things already at the first stage, you would have to assume that
you would have to assume it. That's right.
Okay.
So
you would not really use basic law 5 as it's usually, but you basic law 5 usually has a consequence of proving that you have infinitely many things in your first domain.
And other things, sadly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So either you assume it, or you have infinitely many languages to produce it. Okay.
Yep. So that's right. So this does put the infinity problem in a rather new light. So one of the things that people have gotten so excited about when it comes to using Hume's principle, for instance, proceeding in a Frege way, is that it looks like you get this logical guarantee of an infinite domain. Right? So you could prove by a principle whose stays as logical as at least not utterly far-fetched, that there are infinitely many objects. But that all turns on using abstraction principles that are impredicated. Right? So if you think a little bit about Frege's way of proving that there are infinitely many natural numbers, he does that by first asking you to consider the number of an empty collection. Right? That's 0. Then you know there's at least one object. And that object, that will be something you refer to on the left-hand side, that will, by the impredicativity of the abstraction principle, be in the range of the quantifiers here. Right? So you could apply the principle again and say that I want to consider the collection with 0 as a sole member. That has one member. Right? And you could then, on that basis, prove that 1 is distinct from 0. Aha! Now you have two objects. And by the impredicativity, they are in the range of the quantifiers theorem. Then you could do abstraction of the two-membered collection composed of 0 and 1. And that, of course, has two members, and 2 is distinct from 0 and 1, so lo and behold, you have 3 objects. And you go around in that way, kind of bootstrapping your way up. But that's all turned on all premised on the abstraction principle being impredicate. So once it no longer is, then that is ongoing. So the infinity problem that Hilbert and so many others have grappled with really looks different on this setting. So it's more modest in a way. So unless you put it in infinity at the very first stage, or unless you put it in by doing infinitely many language expansions, you're not going to get infinity.
Now that I've taken advantage of being a chair for the seminar, are there any further questions? We've got time for one Tennessee little question to close the Q&A time. Andrea, would you like to say this one?
Anyone else?
Just as more later, but after
No.
I think we could fit both of you. At least as far as I'm concerned.
Well, let me try to be clear. As far as I have understood, the strategy, Frege's strategy of answering the epistemological question function as far as the abstract object can be treated as a df of something that is whose metaphysical status is more legitimate.
Yeah, has been established.
Direction are direction of line. Thoughts, for example, other abstract objects are the senses of sentences, and so it seems that this strategy requires a sort of a functional nature of the abstract entity. This is the condition in order to eliminate talk of abstract entities. Is there any guarantee that any abstract object can be treated in this functional way?
That's a fantastic question. Yeah, that's a good one. No, not really.
It's a fantastic
Look, I'm after one route into this. I'm fairly pluralistic about these matters. So I think the very core of the Fregean strategy, or namely transforming this question that arises at the subsentential level, individual expressions, how do they come to refer, transforming that into a sentence level question. I think that's a good move, and there are really going to be no alternatives to that. But from that point on, there are different ways to go. And one of the things I wouldn't exclude is that that core idea could be developed in a more structuralist manner, for instance, instead of this very criterion of identity-based Fregean way. And if so, then I would be in a position to be a pluralist and say that, hey, I'm accounting for reference to a whole lot of different mathematical objects, and I'm fine if structuralists someday manage to get their account to work as well, provided only that they too ascribe to or subscribe to the idea of transforming reference questions into sentence level questions. I mean, that's the one issue where I'm less willing to compromise or be pluralistic. So do we have a guarantee? I haven't seen one, and I have none to offer of the sort you had in mind. I guess the only guarantee we have is that when you run the full story here that came up in my exchange with Francesca, then you eventually get a theory that is as strong as set theory. So in terms of just mathematical power, you've got everything you need for any reasonable mathematical purpose. So you have all the abstract objects that you will need for ordinary mathematical purposes. But that's, of course, modulo using the objects you get here to code or represent or do the work of certain other kinds of abstract objects. And if you're not willing to reason modulo that, then I don't know. Does that help?
Yeah, so mine becomes really a follow-up to Francesca's question. It still concerns impredicativity and predictivity. And so the idea is this: the way you treated in the talk and mainly in the paper as well, the problem of impredicativity is as a problem which is half ontological and half semantical. So the half ontological part is there is a sense in which an impredicative abstraction principle presupposes the existence of objects whose existence we would like to prove with the very introduction of the abstraction principle. And the semantic is that if you have an impredicative abstraction principle, there's no way of solving the elimination problem. We call it elimination problem. Okay. The elimination problem. Okay. But then there's at least in the paper, what you say is that we sort of face a dilemma. We face a dilemma. So if we have in one part of the dilemma is that if we have impredicative abstraction principles, we cannot expect the context principle to deliver the explanatory role that it is supposed to play. And so this brought to my mind that neologicists, Christian and Beauvais, answer to Dammet's objection to the impredicativity of this principle by saying that the real important epistemological role of the context principle and this application of the context principles in the Unit's principle and so on is to introduce to someone who's devoid of the concept of number a way of acquiring the concept. And that epistemological project is not threatened by the impredicativity of the principle. So I was wondering, what do you mean by, what's your idea of what is the epistemological I mean, either if you disagree with Crispin and Bob on this, or if you have another idea of what is the proper epistemological role of the context principle.
Yeah, no, I do disagree with him on this, I think. So I'm putting much more emphasis on the elimination of requirement. And part of the material, it's actually this, isn't it? So